This should be a fun episode. I've got a lot of thoughts going on in my brain. Hopefully, the screenplay that I see in here will come out of my mouth and broadcast through the nifty little camera and into your souls. Because what I have planned for this episode is because of somebody that commented on one of my videos. It was one of the shorts. And this comment kind of riled me up and made me do some digging. And I did a lot of digging, particularly in the last 3 hours. Now, I've been working on this episode for probably, let's see, today's the 7th. What is it, Tuesday? So I think I started working on this episode Friday. I started working on it Friday and just kind of let it molder in my head here for a minute. And his comment, I'm assuming it's a him. I don't really remember. Honestly, I don't care because that individual probably isn't going to watch this because it was a negative comment. By the way, let me stop there. Welcome back to the Range Minded Podcast. My name is Steve. The whole purpose of the Range Minded Podcast is to share my love, my passion, my desire for the Second Amendment, and my love for freedom with you. And in the Range Minded Podcast, we talk about all things Second Amendment, whether it be new guns and gadgets, gun laws, training, all that, the whole gambit of the 2A. And again, now let me jump back a few paces and say what we're talking about here. I know this is already a confusing mess, but it'll get better, I promise. This individual posted how the Second Amendment is dead and people are stupid because it's only regarding the militia. And we've been lied to that it's an individual right. I know he's wrong. Again, I'm assuming it's a he. But I had to fortify my conversation. I'm not going to say argument, because this isn't an argument. This is a one-sided conversation with you and the people in my brain. So let's just dive right into this. I'm going to have to refer to my notes because there's copious amounts of information that I'm still trying to distill in a way that will be a way for you guys to understand it. There's a lot on this. And this individual that commented obviously hasn't done any kind of research, hasn't dug into the reality of the Second Amendment, why we have it, contemporary understanding of the purpose of the Second Amendment. They've just fallen into this trap of modern interpretation of something that's existed honestly and in reality, maybe not as the Second Amendment, but as a right given by Providence before this country existed. In fact, we'll talk about it, we'll touch on it in a minute, but Blackstone's commentaries even regards it to something that has happened farther back, even into British common law. So it's important to understand that your individual right has been understood as far as the right to keep and bear arms and self-defense has been understood for a very, very long time. And it has also been understood that it wasn't granted by government, but given by a far superior being as a natural part of this earth. It's easy to look at nature. Again, we're talking about nature's laws in this particular part of the episode, which I wasn't going to talk about. But we look at nature's laws. Let's jump to Africa, right? When you see predators attacking small wildebeests or whatever, right? The lions or the hyenas definitely can attack that small creature or young creature because it has no way to defend itself. But the rest of the herd that have horns can offer some sort of defense. Or we can look at the porcupine. I don't know exactly what species of porcupine it is, but they tend to not be messed with too much because they have quills, a natural defense against predators. Or you look at the honey badger, which often I refer to in the podcast. Their disposition is so cantankerous that very few animals mess with the honey badger because it has a defense against a predator. Nature's laws have existed in perpetuum forever. Let's get to the content that I'm talking about, because this could be a long episode. I honestly have no idea how long this episode is going to take, so we probably shouldn't dilly-dally. Okay, let's start with this. So there are key quotes that I've kind of dug through. And again, I've done a lot of reading in the last 3 hours and before this as well, of things that the founders and contemporary individuals have talked about regarding the Second Amendment and their understanding and their perspective on what kind of right that is and why it should be included in the Bill of Rights. So, very first off, the Second Amendment was ratified in 1791, December 15th of 1791. Now, it reads this: a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. We've heard that paragraph many, many times before. But what you need to understand is that there's two parts to the Second Amendment. Now, it's important to understand that those just aren't a beautiful, flowery amalgamation of words and compiled. Like, there is a specific purpose for how it was written and how it was structured. Okay, that's not just flowery speech. There is a very specific reason why it's written the way that it is. Let's look at this first section of the Second Amendment. It's called the Prefatory Clause. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. That's that first clause. Now, it's written in a way specifically. Yes, it is talking about the militia. But you have to understand what the militia is. There's a modern misunderstanding that militia is something like the National Guard. Well, that didn't exist during the time of the ratification. What they had was a volunteer, well, it wasn't volunteer, you were 18 or older, you were meant to assemble in the militia, but you were not issued arms like what we have today in the standing military. Every individual man was expected, and we're going to go through the Militia Act here in a little while. They were expected to have a firearm, in this case a musket, or I shouldn't say a firearm, arms. And what's spelled out in the Militia Act is they needed a musket, they needed ammunition, they needed powder, they needed some other means, maybe a sword or a saber or something like that. They needed to provide their own arms. Now, why? How could this be a government-given expectation? These individuals wouldn't have to buy this stuff if it wasn't already an individual understanding and an individual right. These men had to buy and understand their own arms. Obviously, the reason was, in terms of the militia, there was no army at the time. There was no funds to procure arms for these individuals. That makes sense. The other thing is, this is clear rationale. Individuals, if they're spending their own money on something, it's probably going to be of better quality than something that would be mass produced at the time. Because individuals care about their stuff. That's why, at least for my stuff, don't call it military grade. It's far better than military grade, the stuff I have in my safe. The other reason that they wanted this militia, and really is the reason for the Second Amendment, was to fight against any kind of tyrannical rule. Think about what is going on at the time, what they just went through as a very young nation. They fought off a tyrannical government that was trying to rule them from across the ocean and imposing these ridiculous laws and ridiculous rules that were really very difficult to follow if they were able to follow them at all. They understood that the citizens needed the power to put any kind of ruling force in check. That included a tyrannical force, like something they just defeated. This ragtag bunch of backwards idiots, at least that's what the British probably thought of them as. Well, they sure kicked their ass, didn't they? Now, we just talked about the prefatory clause. We need to talk about the operative clause. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Now, there's a reason why this is structured the way that it is, and it was not accidental. The operative clause guaranteed the individual right to keep and bear arms for reasons of offense and defense. Those are not my words. Those are contemporary writings of the time. Again, the operative clause is what gives the Second Amendment the power, its teeth, the enforcement. It is what the right is. The prefatory clause introduces it and gives an explanation of why. Let's see, that was the prefatory clause, but the operative clause gives it the reason of the why it must exist, that the individual right is the key of that Second Amendment. Now, I'm going to read this because I need you to understand it, so I got to read the way it's written here on my show notes. So excuse me for having to read, okay? I know I struggle at that. The structure of the Second Amendment was not accidental. It was actually a form of legal writing in the 18th century. The prefatory clause explained the purpose without limiting the main directive. And then as we see, the founders understood the importance of an individual right and put that under the operative clause, which really fortified and clarified, in my opinion, a right that's existed, like we mentioned in the very beginning, for a very long time. They understood the importance of individual freedom, individual liberties, because we see that in the First Amendment. They understood that importance and how it also comes into play when it comes into self-defense and the need to put a tyrannical government in check. Now we need to go back even further, okay? Let's jump back to 1689. Again, I got to reference my show notes because they're copious. We got to go back even further. I got to reference my notes again. The English Bill of Rights of 1689 declared that, quote, the subjects which the Protestants may have arms for their defense suitable to their conditions and as allowed by law. Now, King James, this came into effect because King James II decided he didn't like his political enemies, and he just kind of wiped them out. So that was kind of a bad deal. Almost like there was some tyrant that was enforcing his will, right? Now, Blackstone, in Blackstone's commentaries, which please do some research. I'm going to have a bunch of links in a pinned comment below in the videos. In his Blackstone in 1765, the Blackstone Commentaries was a book that was available to the founders, and it really dug into what was going on. Okay, in the commentaries, he talks about the right of self-defense is a natural law. It's something that was part of nature, and it's part of self-preservation, and civilization needed to incorporate natural law in order to survive, just like animals in nature. And just so you know what I'm talking about, and it doesn't just sound like I'm a blowhard, this is a quote: the natural right of resistance and self-preservation when the sanctions of society and laws are found insufficient to restrain the violence of oppression. Humankind, man, we have the right to defend ourselves under some kind of oppression or violence. That's the way it's been, and that's the way it'll continue to be. Now let's jump back to the colonies. 1775. Almost said seven. No, it is 74. Do you guys remember something called the powder alarm? Well, General Gage, a British officer, and well, honestly, all the British, they were concerned that the colonists were getting a little too big for their britches. There was rumblings of them gathering arms and putting them in stockpiles, which they called magazines, and they would have cannons and artillery and powder, and honestly, powder that the colonists, the rebels, whatever you want to call them, they were stealing powder from the British. And so they were stockpiling them in this place. And finally, it was in Massachusetts, this General Gage decided he was going to confiscate it back. So he took a group of soldiers. By the way, he was tipped off where this storage was by a guy that said that he was the mayor of the town, who was a patriot at first, but then when he decided he didn't want to be pushed around anymore, he decided to be a loyalist again and follow British rule. Anyway, he tipped him off where this was in Massachusetts. Well, the Patriots found out that it was going to get raided, so they took all of their stuff out of this storage and left only a little bit of what they stole from the British in there, so they felt like the British did a good deed. Now, this went around town, around the colonies, I should say, that the British had confiscated some of these stockpiles. And it really caused a huge ruckus. It may have been blown out of proportion a little bit, but nonetheless, the British were starting to impose military force on the colonists. And if you understand the history of the time and the grievances they sent to the king and all this stuff, this was just like a precursor to what was going to happen next, which then brings us to Lexington and Concord. Now, if you remember, the British were going to Lexington to take the rest of the firearms, the arms that the colonists had stored up and made ready for the upcoming war, which they knew was coming. The amount of pressure from the British was ridiculous. And yeah, there was some guerrilla warfare being perpetrated by the Patriots, and it was coming to a head in Concord. Now, you've heard about the shot heard around the world. We're not going to go into the history of Lexington and Concord, but it was a big deal. Oh, let's jump back, by the way. This whole, the thing we were talking about earlier, the powder alarm. When the British saw, because what happened was after the Patriots had heard about this ruckus of them stealing and breaking into these magazine caches, they didn't realize how big the force of the Patriots really were. There was thousands of them that met later on at another confiscation site, which forced the British to back up a little bit and reevaluate the thing. And then when Concord hit and Lexington hit, that's when they realized the absolute force that this ragtag bunch of rebels really had and what they had amassed. Thankfully, that's really, obviously, as you know, that's really when things kind of took a turn for the worse for the British, I guess. And the Civil War, the War of Independence started, and it was epic. Now, later on, there was something called the Declaration of the Causes and the Necessity of Taking Up Arms. This happened in 1775. This was co-authored by Thomas Jefferson. Basically, what had happened is the British were making these threats against the colonists, causing a serious problem. And what Jefferson stated in this act, or this declaration, I should say, was that individuals needed to purchase arms for their defense and the defense of the future country. But still, it was about the citizen, remember the operative clause, to keep and bear arms for natural law of defense. Yes, the citizen then worked its way into the militia because there was no army to help defend the country. It was the citizen's duty to pitch in. None of that was possible, none of it, without individuals having arms of their own to stand up against tyranny. Individuals, not an army. It was an individual right. Now, again, I'm going to really rely on my show notes. I'm going to put these links in a pinned comment. You can read all these. There's just too much to read, too much to dig into. If I go through every one of these documents, it's a lot. So I'm just going to kind of glass over them through my show notes, and then you can go back and research them yourself. I highly, highly recommend it. Yeah, there is a lot of reading, and some of it is Old English, so it's a little bit harder to grasp, but once you start to see how sentences and paragraphs are structured, it'll make sense, I promise. You just got to dig into it and read. Now, these quotes that I've dug up from the founders and from contemporaries at the time, that they're not just trivia quotes, they're not just water ski things. These will help you deep dive into the doctrine, I guess, if you will, of the Second Amendment and the true reason of the why the operative clause has so much teeth and so much bearing. So 1776, when Thomas Jefferson drafted the Virginia Constitution, he said this quote, "No free man shall ever be disbarred the use of arms." No free man will ever be disbarred the use of arms. Why would he say that? Yeah, now we can go into abolitionists, pre getting rid of slaves. And I know there's a lot of people that hate Thomas Jefferson. I get it. That's not what this show's about. But there was a difference between freemen and slaves at the time, though the colonies were working their way towards abolition, whether you like it or not. That's reality. But why would he say no free man should be disbarred the use of arms? Well, you can go dig up a contemporary dictionary at the time and look up what arms meant. And it meant weapons, not just the two things, one on each side of your torso, but it meant weapons, whether it be muskets or swords, things for offense or for defense. Also, it's clear to me anyways that in this writings from Jefferson, again, that it is an individual right. Notice he didn't say free people. Notice he didn't say militia. He said no free man. Who is a free man? The people that are going to be liberated from this independence, like through independence from British rule. I think that's pretty obvious. Let's jump to George Mason. He's often called the father of the Bill of Rights. If you don't know who George Mason is, you need to go back and study some more. There's a lot that I need to learn about Mr. George Mason, but another great founding father. During the ratification debates, this is what he had to say. To disarm the people was the best and most effectual way to enslave them. Wait a minute. If this is about the militia, and only can you arm the militia, that means your goal was to enslave a free people. No. Even Mr. Mason here stated that if you disarm the people, they will eventually become enslaved. Why would he say that? Because they just existed in a place that was a reality to them. They looked at other countries. They looked at how other governments imposed their disposition on the citizens of those countries. He understood again that it's an individual right that a human in this country, at this time, now man or woman, but in general, when they used the term man, it meant a citizen. They had the right to keep and bear arms, an individual right. Shall we keep going? Yeah, well, we're going to, whether you like it or not. By the way, Mason also helped to draft Virginia's Declaration of Rights in 1776, which stated this: "It is a well-regulated militia composed of the body of the people, trained to arms. This is the proper, natural, and safe defense of a free state." And then later on down there, it says, standing body of the people, standing armies. I read the same, never mind. Standing armies in times of peace should be avoided. it is dangerous to liberty. So this time they didn't want a standing army among the people, which you guys should probably pay attention to those words right there. But a standing army just to impose on the people is dangerous to liberty. That is why that right exists, to fight against tyranny. You see, an armed populace, a free populace with arms to defend themselves, is repugnant to a standing military which would impose the will of whoever the governing body would be. You starting to see how this works yet? Let me read that again. That well-regulated militia, composed of the body of the people, trained to arms, is the proper, natural, and safe defense of a free state. That standing armies in time of peace should be avoided as dangerous to liberty. And that in all cases, the military should be under strict subordination to and governed by a civil power. Individual right to keep and bear arms is what fights against a standing army of a tyrannical government to enforce its will upon the people. And the citizens are to be the power, the governing power of that army, of that military force. This is important reading. You guys, I encourage you, please follow the links and read this stuff for yourselves. Now that quote really, I shouldn't say assumes, but it proposes that individuals have already owned and trained with their own personal property, their own arms, to be an effective check against this tyrannical military overwatch, or whatever you want to call it. Now, other states jumped into suit. Pennsylvania, 1776 Declaration of Rights, said this, quote, that the people have the right to bear arms for defense of themselves and the state. Did you hear that? For defense of themselves and the state. As standing armies in the time of peace are dangerous to liberty. They ought not to be kept up. Notice the defense of themselves. That is a personal, individual right. Shall we keep going? We are. Let's just keep going. North Carolina, 1776, that the people have the right to bear arms for defense of the state, and as of standing armies in time of peace are dangerous to liberty. They ought not to be kept up. Notice that they keep bringing back this standing army, almost like they've been dealing with a British standing army staying in their homes and enforcing their will and imposing tyrannical rule from across the pond. Weird. It's almost like they've experienced something that they're counseling and warning against. What's the check to that rule? That's right. Individuals with the same weaponry and firepower as the military that it's enforcing. What about this? 1780, Massachusetts. The people have the right to keep and bear arms for the common defense. Whoopsies. Okay, let's jump to the 1800s, early 1800s. 9 states by that point, by the 1800s, 9 states all had these similar provisions. It's late. I'm trying to say the same things. Most of them are talking about arms as an individual right, that the individual has the right to possess an arm for the defense of themselves and the state. Again, the founders knew and counseled and wrote into the Constitution, or the Bill of Rights rather, that the right of the individual to keep and bear arms is the most important part of the Second Amendment. Now, during the ratification period of the Constitution, there were anti-federalists like Patrick Henry. You guys remember Patrick Henry? At least you better understand or remember that dude's name because he was a badass. He wanted him and his cohorts wanted explicit protections on an individual right. At the Virginia Convention, this is what Henry said. The great object is that every man be armed. Everyone who is able may own a gun. He didn't say anything about a militia. He said that every able man should have the right to have arms. That's interesting to me. James Madison. That name should sound familiar too. In Federalist Papers number 46. By the way, if you haven't read or listened to the Federalist Papers, get to it. I know it gets kind of boring and drawn out, but there's some important and an amazing amount of information regarding our country's founding and our liberties in those documents. So number 46, my favorite. You'll see why. In 46, Federalist number 46, it argued that Americans had the advantage of being armed. They looked at other countries and how the despotic leadership of those countries really put the thumb down on American citizens, or on their citizens. And that's why it was so important for the American citizen, the future citizen of America, whatever you want to call it, the importance of them having arms, because then they could not be controlled by a tyrannical government. And they understood that if citizens were armed, it was a huge deterrent from other countries to come to invade, even though we were at this point already kicking England's ass out of the country. They knew that there was still a possibility of other countries coming in to try and take over the colonies and the future America. But if the citizens had their own firearms, they didn't need necessarily a huge standing military. They had a citizen military, if you will, or the militia, oddly enough, comprised of people who owned their own stuff to fight off future invaders. It wasn't a dumb idea. Now, it was this point in my research that I found one of my new favorite heroes of the Second Amendment. I didn't even know who this guy was. I'd never heard of this guy's name before, and shame on me, because I'm sure some of you have heard of this guy before. His name, Tench Coxe. I love, what a cool name. Tench, T-E-N-C-H. That's his first name, Tench Coxe. He was a key Federalist. In fact, I'm going to, later on, maybe, I don't know, we'll see where it is. I'm going to read something that he wrote about the Second Amendment and how important it was. At least I think it's important. Tench Coxe in 1788 wrote this, quote, "As civil rulers may attempt to tyrannize, the people are confirmed by the next article in their right to keep and bear their private arms." Private arms. Sounds like an individual ownership, right? Individual right. By the way, let's visit this Tench Coxe quote here. Let me pause. It's going to be just a second for you, but I got to dig it up. Hold on. All right. Again, I'm going to have all this stuff linked in the pinned comment below. So this is something that Tench Coxe wrote in an issue of the Aurora, which was a Pennsylvania, I think a newspaper at the time. So let's read this stuff. "But as men intent upon hostility have associated themselves to military corps, it becomes your duty to associate likewise. Arm and organize yourselves immediately. Do you wish to preserve your rights? Arm yourselves. Do you desire to secure your dwellings? Arm yourselves. Do you wish to defend against assassins or bullyrocks of faction? Arm yourselves. Do you wish to assemble in security to consult for your own good or for the good of your country? Arm yourselves. To arms, that you may then sit down contented, each man under his own fig tree, and have no one to make him afraid. And if you are desirous to contract a design of pregnant with misery and ruin, then arm yourselves. For in a firm, imposing, and dignified attitude will consist your own security, and that your families to arms, then to arms. Arm yourselves. Right? So what he's saying is, if there's a military force that comes against you, arm yourselves with the same thing that they have. If you want to be free, arm yourselves. If you want to defend your country, your community, your home, your family, arm yourselves. If you want to live in peace and sit under your fig tree, arm yourself. Why would he say that? Because Tench Coxe knew and understood the importance of the individual right to keep and bear arms. And he was a staunch defender of that right. And he wrote extensively on that individual right and the importance of that right. He is one of my new heroes. And man, he wrote a lot of stuff about it. By the way, if you look at the links and you're looking for where that Aurora quote was, it was on page like 19 or 20 of that file that will be shared to you, which is actually an article written by some contemporary historians to us. Still an amazing article, and Tench Coxe, he's a badass. We talked about Blackstone's commentary a few minutes ago. Well, hey, don't forget St. George Tucker's version of Blackstone's commentary, or his edition, of Blackstone's commentaries, said this: the right of self-defense is the first law of nature, the true palladium of liberty. Wait a minute. Another contemporary author stating that the right of the people to keep and bear arms is an individual right and not a collective right pertaining to militia. Interesting. All of these quotes, all of these things that I just touched on, they're not like these ambiguous, void of substance comments. They are explicit. They are very poignant to point out that it is an individual right, not a collective right. Again, the operative clause gives it its purpose. Struggling talking, guys. Now, in the initial version of the Bill of Rights, Madison wrote, this is 1789. This is the initial version. I'm sorry, it's late. I'm super tired, but I'm still doing this for you guys. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. A well-armed and a well-regulated militia being the best security of a free country. But no person rigorously scrupulous of bearing arms shall be compelled to render military service in person. Now, the rest of the founding fathers, they didn't really like it. In fact, Congress ended up tweaking it to what it is today, clarifies it, and really fortifies the individual and personal aspect of the Second Amendment. Now, let's talk about the Militia Act of 1792. Again, look for the links in the pinned comment. There's a lot there. Now, talking about what the militia was, it was any man 18 to 45. Yeah, I had to look at my notes again. They were meant to be in the service of militia in their own town or commonwealth or whatever. Whatever local breakdown of those militias were made back then. I don't know how it was all broken up at the time. I didn't live back then. But again, 18 to 45. But they were expected. Now go read through the whole Militia Act. This is like 2/3 of the way down. They were expected to provide within 6 months their own musket. Let me read the quote. Let's see. They provide himself with a good musket or firelock. Provide himself meaning buy or get their own. Okay, they had to procure their own stuff. The militia was not going to provide it for them. This, again, the Militia Act presumed or made manifest, I guess, that the individual was to purchase their own thing. If it was militia service only, if the Second Amendment just encompassed militia service, then why didn't the militia provide those arms? Now, if the militia gave them something, then the militia could take it away. But if an individual purchased this arm, then government could not take it away. Of course, unless some crime may have been committed or whatever. That can definitely be looked up and researched in legal mumbo jumbo back in the day. But that's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about any kind of malice or crime committed. Sure, at that point, maybe stuff could have been taken away. I don't know. I didn't live back then. But in order for somebody to qualify for militia service, they had to purchase their own arms and things to support those arms in battle. Read through the Militia Act and understand that. You were expected to have your own stuff. And most men at that time had their own things to procure food for their table. But in this case, it was to fight against some kind of a tyrannical rule or foreign army in an invasion. Again, that's the understanding. You see how things work in the Second Amendment? Yes, the militia was a part of the founding, and yes, it was a part of the Second Amendment. But what fortifies that is the individual right to keep and bear those arms to help sustain the militia at the time. Now, this is where we're starting to get to some more contemporary arguments. Now, there's going to be people that want to destroy the Second Amendment, and they'll look at it during the Reconstruction time of the country. So we're talking the 1870s, right? So states versus Krusherk, I can't say that. Kirkishank? Sure, we'll go with that. Now, they said that it was you couldn't disarm a freeman after the Reconstruction era, but it still never negated the pre-existing context of an individual right. But we'll just keep going. Yeah, we can't look at the Second Amendment during the Reconstruction era, and we'll get into the reason why here in a minute. Now, 1786, a few years later, this was Presser versus Illinois. It upheld the state bans on private militias parading with arms, but it never talked about the individual ownership aspect of the Second Amendment. 1840, Alabama case, State versus Reed. It said this, quote, "A man is not to be disarmed of his weapons unless he's using them in a manner to create public terror." Okay, so we mentioned earlier, unless there's a crime committed, you can't disarm the individual. A very important decision there. Let's jump to something that's in our lifetime, and these are groundbreaking and very important cases to understand. Okay, we've talked about this before, and many of us hate this decision. U.S. v. Miller, 1939. This is where we got the NFA. We hate the NFA. It's a burdensome tax that is, in my opinion, and many of my friends, it's an illegal tax. Now, this was upholding the ban on sawed-off shotguns. Again, this is Miller, 1939, because they were not in militia. They did not have use in the militia. So it was a little bit of a misunderstanding of the Constitution as it existed, or the Bill of Rights then. And this is where we start seeing the slippery slope of, well, it's a militia right, not an individual right. And if you understand how hard America was pushing against all individual rights of American citizens in the 30s and 40s, I mean, we had Prohibition. We just come out of the Great Depression. There was a lot of stuff going on at the time. But again, it twisted the Second Amendment to a collective right, not an individual right, which is wrong. We just read a small portion of some founders' quotes and speeches and talks and writings about how it's an individual right and has been from the beginning of time for somebody to have arms in defense of themselves. Let's see. 21st century, this is when things really, really changed for the better. So in 2008, we had Columbia, D.C. versus Heller. That was a 5-4 decision. And Antonin Scalia, who was a stalwart of individual rights, not just the Second Amendment, but individual rights, was an amazing, amazing justice. And he totally died way too early and under weird circumstances. I mean, who sleeps underneath their pillow? He said this in that decision, that in the majority opinion: the Second Amendment protects an individual right to possess a firearm and to use that arm for traditionally lawful purposes, such as self-defense within the home. Now, there's a lot of folks who still say, well, you can only have guns inside your home because of the way that was worded. Man, I'm struggling. Sorry. But don't worry. We get more clarity. Let's see. Another part of that is it's important to understand this as well. This is also in the Heller case. The Second Amendment provides a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of the free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. In interpreting this text, we are guided by the principle that the Constitution was written to be understood by voters. Its words and phrases were used in their normal and ordinary, as distinguished from technical meaning. So what he's saying is, it was written in plain English back then. It was easy to understand for the citizens, and it's still easy to understand. Scalia dissected history. Sorry. It's late. I try not to read my show notes directly just because it gets weird. But as he went through the history of the Second Amendment, he also points out the operative and the prefatory and the operative clauses, and it really is important. Heller was a huge decision because it really started to fortify the individual right aspect of the Second Amendment and how important it was to understand for every citizen now, just as they did during the founding era, that the right existed not just for hunting, but to fight against tyrannical rule and for self-defense. Now, a couple of years later, in 2010, we had McDonald v. Chicago. Justice Alito wrote that in those rulings that the right of the Second Amendment was a fundamental right for liberty, like it was important for individual liberty. And the right to keep and bear arms has always been that fundamental right. I mean, that was really more about the 14th Amendment as well as the Second Amendment, but still, it's individual right. Now, Caetano versus Massachusetts. Man, I really am sorry. It's getting late. In 2016, maybe you haven't heard of this. We have talked about the Caetano case before. This is where we get the term common use. Now, we're not going to dive into this. You're welcome to find that other show where we do talk about Caetano. But even though it was about stun guns, it created this framework of what defines common use, which will come into play later on. That was a huge and pivotal moment for the Second Amendment community. A lot of people don't understand, or they misinterpret, I should say, what the Second Amendment is, thinking it is just about guns, and it is not. It is about anything for the use of offense or defense. That includes, in this case, the Caetano case, stun guns are for the use of self-defense. And the conversation of, well, we can ban them, but we can't. If there's so many, then we shouldn't be able to ban them. And that's where the common use test kind of comes into play. And I think it was 100,000 in public hands. It might have been 200,000. But if we say the 200,000 threshold was real, I'll have to dig into that to make sure for 100%. I want to say that was pretty close to what the common use threshold was. Well, if you look at suppressors or machine guns or SBRs, I mean, they're all past that 200,000 threshold. We all have stuff that is now in common use. Later on, we look at this was probably one of the biggest and most important pivotal cases. that fortified our Second Amendment was NYSERPA versus Bruin, which is an amazing case. Clarence Thomas, who is an absolute saint when it comes to individual rights, not just the Second Amendment. When we talked about Scalia, Thomas is just as important with some of his opinions. It went to and clarified the 14th Amendment as well, protecting an individual right. But he also talked about the Second Amendment. Remember in Heller, we talked about Scalia said inside the home. Well, NYSERPA versus Bruin went beyond that and said, hey, the Second Amendment goes on the bounds of your dwelling. You can use that outside your home as well. And really what that did is it started to dismantle New York's carry ban or concealed weapons permit ban, saying that, hey, you have to issue these because the individual right of a person to defend himself outside of his home exists. Like, it is a fundamental right and an individual right. Now, Caetano and McDonald and Bruin and Heller, every one of those decisions from the Supreme Court really upheld the importance of that constitutional right as it exists for the individual, not just the militia. So to just say, hey, it only happens to be for a militia service, the Supreme Court justices have ruled time and time again that the Second Amendment is an individual right, not a collective militia right. I don't know how much more clear it has to be. So why does this still matter today? Is the Second Amendment still relative today? And does it only exist for militia use? Well, we no longer have state-sanctioned or municipality-sanctioned militias. We have the National Guard. We have an actual standing army. So as far as that's concerned, yeah, it's dead. It doesn't exist. Though the Second Amendment, as it was written back in the day, does specifically mention militias. And as we visited in the last few minutes of this podcast, this episode, that the militias were composed and comprised of individuals who were expected to have their own arms to bring for the use and defense of their families, their homes, and their country in that militia service. The militia did not issue these arms. The man, 18 to 45, was expected to purchase those and to have good condition, working condition arms for the use of defense, of the national security defense. But we see these contemporary rulings from the Supreme Court really fortified and cemented in the importance of the operative clause, the last section of the Second Amendment, stating that it is an individual right, that the person has the right as defined by nature's laws and not by sanctioned by the federal government, has that right of self-defense, whether it be from tyranny or some other force. It cannot be spelled out any clearer than what the founders had intended. Please take the time to look at those links, to look at the research, to do the reading. You're going to do like I did eventually, and you're just going to start looking through all these documents and seeing how important, especially the debates of during the ratification. Like, when you read the conversations between the founders during that time, you're going to really see the intent and the purpose of the Constitution and how they viewed our rights. It is so damn important that you understand that. The Second Amendment is under constant attack, and if the founders were alive today, they would be pissed. Absolutely pissed. Looking at what states like Massachusetts, one of the most important original constitutions in the colonies, when it came to individual rights of self-defense and the use of arms for the individual, if they could see what Massachusetts has become and how it oppresses its citizens, they would be appalled, absolutely appalled. And if they looked at what our national government is doing with the whole country combined, they would be absolutely disgusted. Disgusted. But that's not what this episode is about. This episode is about you having the individual God-given right, or if you want to use the words of the founders, rights given by providence of self-defense, including the right to keep and bear arms. Yes, the Second Amendment mentions a militia, but the important part, the most important part of that paragraph is the right of the people, the individual, to keep and bear arms. The founders knew exactly what they were doing. They used those words on purpose. That paragraph was structured the way that it is on purpose. It wasn't flippant. It wasn't by accident. They knew exactly what they were doing. They had just fought off a massive, the world's largest military. A bunch of ragtag, backwoods guerrilla fighters beat the pants off of the largest military force at the time. And a huge reason for that was the citizens had arms to defend themselves, their families, and their communities, and it was an individual right bestowed upon them, not by the government, but by God. Why does that apply to you? Because you, if you live in the United States anyways, you are a citizen of this country. You have that right still as valid and as powerful as it is today as it was then, even though it is under constant attack. Exercise that right. Understand why you have that right. Understand the prefatory and the operative clause and why they are the way they are. Dig into those links that are going to be in that pinned comment. Learn. Knowledge is power. Once you're armed with knowledge, like remember the last episode? We talk about gaining knowledge because it is the best concealed weapon out there. Knowledge is 100% power. And when you learn how to defend yourself under verbal attacks, when it comes to your rights in the Second Amendment, you can deflect those fiery arrows from those people that don't understand but just want to take your freedom from you. The Second Amendment is the second in the Bill of Rights for a reason. We have the right to speech. We have the right to say what we want to say. We also have the right to stand up for those principles, even if it comes to violence. Not as the aggressor, but one in defense. You're awesome. Every one of you guys is awesome. And I truly appreciate the time that you spend here in this show. I've talked about, I keep forgetting, I shouldn't say this at the end of the show. I should stay at the beginning. I really want to hit 1,000 subs, whether it be on YouTube, Rumble, Spotify, or wherever that you're listening. Make sure you share this with your friends. If you've seen any kind of value in this content, make your vote count, I guess, if you will, and subscribe and share it with somebody that needs to hear this. You guys, your voice is far more stronger than you realize. Your individual rights have so much power that the federal government, as we know it today, the crazy left, they want to take that power from you. Why do they want that power so badly? Because your voice and your individual rights have immense power to fight against tyranny. You need to understand that. You guys are awesome. I appreciate everything you're doing. I want a specific shout out to a listener, and she's going to giggle when she hears this, but B, you're awesome. I appreciate you listening to the show every week. You're super rad, and that's just a shout out to you. And I put that at the end on purpose, so that way I know you watch the whole show. Anyways, stay safe, take somebody shooting, and as always, stay range-minded. See you guys.